Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Good afternoon. We're at the South Asian Conclave 2019, and today we have with us Dr. Christine Fair. Her recent book on Lashkar-e-Taiba is just out, and we are here to talk with her. Welcome, Dr. Fair. The first question is, what makes Lashkar-e-Taiba such an establishmentarian actor? Why is it that they're so loyal to the Pakistani army? And also, how does the Pakistani army manage to have such strong control over that organization?
Well, I think part of it is that, so Lashkar formed itself, right, at the very end of the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan. Without the resources that the Pakistan army gave it, we wouldn't even know about Lashkar-e-Taiba, bluntly speaking. So I think that's the first thing, is that the army made Lashkar what it would become. But I think the other reason, and it's interrelated to the first, is that unlike the other groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban, they're all Deobandi. These Deobandi organizations, they have a much larger cultural infrastructure to draw upon, like mosques and madrasas, and these are very lucrative enterprises.
Right.
So in contrast, Lashkar-e-Taiba is an LA Hadith organization, whereas the Deobandi organizations that are militant, they have no significant ideological disagreements with the mainstream Deobandi ulama in Pakistan, and they also have a political party in which these ulama participate. Lashkar is completely cut off from the other mainstream LA Hadith organizations, and there are very few LA Hadith organizations to begin with. So Lashkar is drawing upon a very small part of a much smaller subset of institutions relative to the Deobandis. So this makes them much more dependent upon the Pakistani state than the Deobandis are. Right? So literally, they can't genuinely survive without the Pakistan army. And they're small, and the Pakistan army could, in my view, squash them if they wanted to. It would be much harder for the Pakistan army to turn comprehensively against the Deobandi groups, which is why you see the Pakistan army generating these splits amongst these Deobandi groups. That's how they control their power, their accumulation of resources and assets. So that's part of it. Pakistan army made them, and they have fewer resources on their own, which makes them ever more dependent upon the Pakistani state.
Right. So a part of this meritocratic nature of LET and its members is that the army and the establishment also use them for a lot of domestic purposes beyond this all-out war with Deobandi groups. So what are the other kind of domestic roles does LET play in Pakistan?
So the biggest threat to the Pakistani state is really coming from sectarian violence, right? And the groups that are doing that are Deobandi. They practice takfir, which is calling a Muslim to be a kafir, and then holding him or her to be wajib al-qatl, meaning deserving of death. So Lashkar domestically actually is opposed to this doctrine. They're also, for this reason, opposed to the Islamic State, which also practices takfir. And so what the Pakistani state does, it encourages this organization to engage in philanthropic roles domestically. So in the guise of Jamaat al-Dawa, Falah Insaniyat Foundation, you'll see it doing different kinds of social service work. And they're doing that social service work to build up a Lashkar presence where they can be used to counteract problems that are arising for the state. So if you see them in Balochistan taking care of earthquake victims, it's because the state wants to use Lashkar to counter, but of course they don't call themselves Lashkar domestically, right? They operate in the name of Jamaat al-Dawa. They want Jamaat al-Dawa to participate in countering the Baloch insurgency. If we see them in Sindh building wells and providing medical care for Hindus, it's because the state wants to encourage them to convert Hindus. Now what we're seeing is that Lashkar-e-Taiba is increasingly playing a role in trying to manage the Pashtun crisis under the guise of the PTM. So domestically, LET is very important to the Pakistani state.
So now that we're on that note, what are your major takeaways from the recent Pulwama Balakot attack and the escalation dynamics that ensued and then eventually subsided?
Well, my views on this are not terribly popular. I think And I think there's not been enough accountability for claims. First of all, we know the Pakistanis lie, right? So we don't need to belabor the fact that Pakistan lies, right? But since India is a democracy, we kind of expect more accountability, right? So, for example, no evidence that an F-16 was shot down. In fact, as more and more time passes, it's ever more clear there was no F-16 shot down. And no one is saying, oh, hey, why did we have the chief of the Indian Air Force make a claim that ended up not being true? There were briefings in which it would be generous to say, what's the word I'm looking for that won't be too outrageous? Less than accurate information was passed on, and it was happening in a period of an election, right? And people tend to take the word of the service chiefs here as immutable truth. As an American, I don't accord my military because all militaries are actually more political than anyone wants to imagine. You don't get a star by not being not political, right? So I think what I would have hoped was there would have been more inquiry about the information that was being provided. And there really hasn't been any demands for accountability. So going back to the larger questions with the conflict dynamic, actually Pakistan is the only one who knows what happened, right? Pakistan knows how many people died. Pakistan knows what the damage assessment was. And from a person who studies this academically, why does the truth matter? Well, it matters that we know what India's intentions were. It also matters what India's capabilities were, right? So if you have this mismatch between what people think their government tried to do and what their government could do, the next time there's a crisis, there's going to be a demand for something even more spectacular, right? And so in some sense, I would argue that after Pulwama, Modi was actually competing with himself in the film Uri, right? Where Modi was made to look in a particular way in a film that was very well timed for the election. How do you compete with yourself that's just been dramatized in a widely popular film, right? And as evidence of this, I was quite surprised to see things like how's your Josh, taking off on social media. So when you have an empirical mismatch between what the government, any government, by the way, my government, I don't care what government it is, when you have a mismatch between what it says it's trying to do and what it can do and what it actually tried to do and what it actually can do, this is not a recipe for stability. So I think the other thing is that horrifically, Pakistan came out of that. I mean, it was actually able to steal some kind of a victory out of the mouth of defeat. Right? Pakistan slaughters a bunch of people in Pulwama, and it ends up looking like the diplomatic star, right? And so to me, it's quite interesting. I think over the long haul, Pakistan benefited more from that than India did.
For a long time, you've had a sort of twofold prescription for what Indian strategy should be with respect to Pakistan. The first part of it is subconventional deterrence, and the second part is striking a right offensive-defensive balance. If you could just tell us very briefly what this means, and more importantly, do you think India has the actual capabilities to adopt such a strategy?
So just to tweak your characterization. So I'm a fan of full spectrum deterrence, right? In India, you talk about conventional deterrence or nuclear deterrence. No one ever talks about subconventional, right? But yet, subconventional is where Pakistan engages in most of its chicanery, right? So if you don't have subconventional deterrence as a part of full spectrum deterrence, you're obviously missing part of that spectrum.
Right.
So now the problem that India confronts is that it doesn't want to be the moral equivalent of Pakistan, right? So I would, for example, caution against instrumentalizing Baloch insurgents. The reason is Baloch insurgents, they are indisciplined, they kill a lot of civilians, and what does it actually get you? It doesn't, other than showing that we can really make your life difficult in Balochistan, it also does run the risk of for example, having Indian assets captured and shown all over Pakistani TV. And Pakistanis will believe that, even though the guy may or may not have been captured in Iran, right? And so I may or may not be talking about Jadhav.
Right.
But if you were to instead try to exacerbate these fissures in the jihadi groups, you could actually advance your interests, right? So if you were to take advantage of the fact that TNSM hates Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? Or that Islamic State hates Lashkar-e-Taiba, you could both advance subconventional deterrence while also advancing other aspects of your strategic interests. But this is hard to do because you have to have the cultivation of these kinds of assets. And so that's not easy to do, and you can't do it tomorrow, right? And the other problem that India confronts is that India doesn't have the ability to decisively defeat the Pakistan army in a short war. It simply doesn't. And I think as you look at the current Indian defense budget, right? To quote one Indian journalist, this is not a budget that makes India a superpower.
Right.
And I think India also has these fixations upon things that are very specifically Indian. So this fetishization of indigenization at the expense of warfighting capabilities, right? This is not a trade-off that to an outsider makes sense given the threat environment that India confronts with an ever-increasing boldness in China after Doklam, and obviously the Pakistan situation. And then also India likes to diversify its assets, right? Well, most global powers don't do that. And the reason is if you've got 5 different kind of aircraft, you've got 5 different logistical tails that have to go behind each. And that really eats into your tooth to tail ratio because you're spending all of this time feeding the beast and the beast can't do its job, right? So for India to become a global military power in the way in which we conventionally understand it, there needs to be a way of thinking that's quite different about defense production, about consolidation of platforms as opposed to diversification of platforms, and just a more general sense of comfort with projecting power. I still think there are many Indians that don't feel comfortable with power projection, right? There are a lot of Nehruvians who would say, you know, our primary strength is soft power projection, right? So these are all things that are very difficult to resolve, and the very vibrant nature of India's democracy makes these issues even harder to resolve.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Right, thank you.
Thank you for talking to The Print.
Thank you.
It was a deeply insightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.